Welcome to the Hembury Books Podcast. Today we have Blake Atwood. Blake is a book coach, developmental editor, and ghostwriter based in Texas. He has partnered with nonfiction authors like James Clear of Atomic Habits, who thanked Blake in the acknowledgements section of his best-selling book for transforming my ugly and insanely long first drafts into a tight, readable manuscript. More recently, Blake worked with the attorney and communications expert whose videos have gone viral, Jefferson Fisher. Together, they crafted The Next Conversation, which is coming out in March through the Penguin imprint Tarcherperigee. Blake, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jessica.
You have done so many impressive things. I would love to begin with your ghostwriting. How did you become a ghostwriter?
Sure. I'll say at the outset that I didn't do any ghostwriting on Atomic Habits or The Next Conversation. I have to be really careful about that.
Sure.
Just want to respect my client. But for the ghostwriting work I have done ages ago, I also have to preface this by saying that my freelance career has occurred in two phases from 2014 to 2019. And then I only recently got back into freelancing as of April of this year.
Yes.
So
okay.
There's kind of a break, which is an interesting, maybe for another time. But when I first got into ghostwriting in 2014, I was doing a lot of copy editing work. And so people knew that I could edit grammar. And I reached out and said, well, I'm looking for more ghostwriting work. I wanted to break into ghostwriting. And a friend of a friend referred me to somebody that she knew. And fortunately, the client was local. He contacted me via email. We hit it off. We met in person and we were off to the races. So it was in some ways seamless and kind of fortuitous, honestly. But just having hopefully a record of good work and being known as hopefully easy to work with led to a book project.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's the power of recommendation, because without it, that would never have happened. So luck does not play a part in that.
Absolutely.
Except for the location of your client. That was lucky. And how did you promote yourself as a ghostwriter, like especially in your early days when, like, was your name, did it appear on the inside cover, the back cover?
For that first one, I'd actually have to look. I think it did. I think I was acknowledged in there, but that client actually referred me to another client, which led to more work. So it just started happening. And that's when I really thought, maybe I can make a go of it as a freelancer, because when I first started freelancing, my wife said, well, you have 6 months to show me that we can sustain this. And I was like, that's fair. That's also part of the story too, is that she was working full time and she was making a whole lot more than I was. And she's very smart, but she was also very supportive. So even in, I could take a risk because it wasn't a huge risk for our family at the time. But to get back to your question, promoting myself, the referrals absolutely helped. But then you can't always rely on one to get clients. And so back then I started writing a monthly column for the writelife.com. The columns are still up there. They're pretty old by now, but that helped to get my name out. It actually helped get my name to show up better on Google, because when people would search like Blake or ghostwriter or writer, they would find my articles. And so it was always fascinating to me when people would contact me and say, hey, I was searching for this and then I found your name and I have these questions. And so that was the other thing, is that if you can prove yourself helpful at the outset with no ulterior motive of like, well, I want this person to become a client. It's just like, give help, be helpful. And then maybe they turn into a client, maybe they don't, but then they also have had a really good experience with you to where if they know somebody who needs somebody, hopefully you're top of mind. So that really helps.
Absolutely. But it's a different kind of job where you can't the book comes out and you say, hey, that's me, I wrote that. So the promotion of your own writing skills is you have to be strategic and diplomatic about how you go about that.
Yes, absolutely. I think that was the hardest thing for me when I first tried to break into ghostwriting, is that, well, how can I show somebody that I know how to write? And then it gets even farther than that, because you have to show that you can write in the voice of that person. So
my next question, how do you do that?
Yeah, exactly. I would say for anybody who is trying to look to get into it, absolutely have some writing clips, have some things that you've written yourself that you can show to other people. You have to have that as a baseline. But then if you're interested in writing for another person, do something on spec. Write, 500 words in their voice just to show them what you're capable of. For me, one of my favorite stories about writing in somebody else's voice is actually not a ghostwriting project. It was kind of a heavy developmental edit. It's a book called Feeding the Mouth That Bites You. It's a great title. And the author is gosh, I always confuse these two. I don't know why. I'll say he's a counselor. He's like a family counselor. And so it's a parenting book. And when he came to me, it was very academic because that was his background. And when you read it, you kind of just wanted to close your eyes and go to sleep. And he would agree. I think he would agree with my assessment. But then I listened to him give a talk, like to parents, and he was funny. And I was like, why is this not in your book? Where's the disconnect? And we wound up putting that into his book, and he self-published, and like in a couple of weeks, I think maybe next month, it's being re-released because a publisher picked it up.
Wow.
So it's been like so well. So the moral of that story is, especially if you're a public speaker, you have to figure out, you have to make their writing voice sound like their speaking voice. And so that's such a key part of like ghostwriting, is figuring out, listening to that person over and over and over, and meeting them in person. I think that's important. Seeing them face to face, hearing their inflection, seeing their body language, really learning how to really inhabit who they are so that you can write like them. But it's also a collaboration all through the process, because I have written things, I will send it back to the author, and they'll be like, I would never use this word in my life. Sometimes they're like, I don't even know what that word means. And because I went to college, I have an English major. And so I kind of think I want to use those big words, but typically the big words aren't the best words, because they don't communicate as clearly and they don't communicate in the author's voice. So that's probably a long answer to a short question, but
no, that's amazing insights. Are there any memorable ghostwriting projects that you can tell us about?
Ooh.
Or is it client confidentiality?
I mean, typically confidentiality. I'm trying to think of anything really interesting. I will share with you, because you're a ghostwriter as well, correct?
Yeah.
I did make a note for that first ghostwriting book. I joke about this. I didn't know anything at the time, I'll be honest. So I made a really elaborate spreadsheet of, okay, we have to meet this many times, and I'm going to charge this amount per meeting. And then I'm going to have to do this kind of editing for this many. Like, I broke it down, all different rates. It was a dumb spreadsheet. So 50,000 words, I charged $3,776.
That's so low.
Which is very low, as you know. But at the time, I thought this is great. But it really did help me get my foot in the door. And I think maybe that's another lesson too, is that when you're starting out, you can't expect to charge what a typical ghostwriter would charge these days.
Right. Absolutely.
Because you don't have the experience, you're going to learn a lot on that first project, which I did. And I was so grateful because the client was really patient with me. He was really happy with the product. So I joke about how little I charged, but I just didn't know.
But it's one of the most lucrative forms of writing if you reach the status of J.R. How do you pronounce his surname? Moringa, who wrote.
Yeah, I don't actually know. Yeah, Moeringer. Sure.
But I mean, he got $1 million for that book. He really is top of the tree. But it must be such a tiny percentage of people who have a reputation like his, and he's been doing it for decades. So when you're also working as like a developmental editor, do you work with clients intensively over a short period? You said you like meeting face to face, and I heard on another podcast that you spent a week with Jefferson Fisher. I'm so jealous.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing about Jefferson is that maybe I'm just jaded by our culture in general and just seeing things online and being like, well, that's like your online persona. And like Jefferson is the same. Like who you think he is? Yeah, he's such a great guy. And I was so really honored to get to work with him.
Yeah.
And so the story about meeting with him for a week is that we essentially had 3 months to shape up his manuscript to get it to the publisher. I was brought in kind of late in the process, but he was like, well, I got to get this done. So let's figure out what we can do. So we essentially ping-ponged his manuscript back and forth, just by email. And we got to some time frame. I forget how little we had left. And I was like, well, I don't think we're going to get there. And so I said, are you open to just spending a week and us knocking this out? And he said, absolutely. I will do whatever we need to. And so he hosted me in his office. He catered it. I got spoiled. He even said I haven't eaten that well since.
What's the life of an attorney who runs his own practice, right?
Absolutely. And so he's still doing his job as he's trying to get this book done.
For people who may not be familiar with him, the way it comes across is that he's ducked into his car on his lunch break to record clip about how to communicate better and to say what you mean and mean what you say. But could you give a background of kind of his meteoric rise to being an internet sensation?
Yeah. So he started as a trial attorney and he opened his own firm. It's called Fisher Firm. It's in Southeast Texas. And he wanted to start making he knew he needed to be on social media. So he started making videos, but he's like, I don't want to make the kind of lawyer videos that you typically see on TV, like those kind of commercials. And so he thought, well, what do I really know? I know how to communicate. I can teach other people how to do this. And so he just started with what he had, which was his phone and his car, like the only quiet space in his life he may have.
Wow.
And so he was just so consistent with it, and it just blew up, like millions of followers on most of his social channels. And so, agents started to court him and said, hey, have you thought about a book? And people will see the book in March.
He let them place their bids. He accepted the winner probably.
Yeah.
And wow. And so was that a fantastic, obviously the book hasn't come out yet, but does it distill, these bite-sized pieces? Does it have a thread running through it?
It's definitely a thread. It has his framework for his communication style. And so you will get some of the things that he shares in his videos, but a lot of it, as far as I'm aware, because I almost can't keep up with everything he posts, a lot of it is new. And so I think people will really appreciate what it has to offer. So we're really excited and hopeful that it will be that people can't escape it.
I feel that way too. Yeah, I think he's marvelous. What was it like working with James Clear of Atomic Habits?
Yeah. So James and I worked in 2014, September. Wait, no, 20. I'm way off here. September of 2017.
Yep.
And so this was not really when virtual meeting was popular, because I think like Google Meets had just launched that year, maybe. So a lot of our communication was just by email and by Google Docs and just ping-ponging his content back and forth. He was very, I would say, business-like, but in a good way. Like he's like, this is what I need to have accomplished and this is what we need to do. But like I shared with you, or I think you may have heard on another podcast, there's just like some gold hidden in those emails that I still have of just things that he was thinking at the time. And at the time, I considered him like, he's just another client. He's not James Clear. He's just another client.
Through another colleague who referred him to you.
Yeah, on another client's book to help develop it. And the other client knew James and said, hey, I liked what this guy did. I know that you're working on this. I know you need some help, some outside help to look at it. So yeah,
did it have a working title of Atomic Habits back then?
No, it did not. And I should have looked this up because he did send me a list of titles he was considering. And I did not pick Atomic Habits. I don't know what I said. I was like, I just don't think that's going to resonate. And then, I don't know anything about titles. Put it that way. Titles are so hard.
Titles are so hard. But this is, you throw something out into the world. This is part of the creative process and you don't know how it's going to land. You don't know who's going to pick it up and who's going to latch onto it. 24 million people have latched onto it because I've been rereading it this week ahead of talking to you. And on my cover, it says 1 million copies sold.
Yeah.
It's 24 million.
It keeps going up.
So he came to you, is it correct? His manuscript was 100,000 words long and your task was to help him shorten that, tighten it up.
Right. That's correct. He wanted to get it down to 80,000 or 70,000.
And what was your initial assessment of Atomic Habits when you read through it?
If I can remember that long ago, I remember thinking this is a really good book. And I remember thinking, I'm glad I get to work on this because I'm actually learning from this. Like my favorite projects are where I feel like I'm becoming a better person because I'm reading. And so I saw it and I thought, yes, this is good. Maybe at the time I thought also, but there are so many habit books. Like I said, it's such a big topic. So really like, who does he think he is trying to write a book about like the best book about habits ever? And then lo and behold, I mean, arguably he's written the best book about habits ever.
It's also a modest book in a lot of ways. It's not overly ambitious. And I think is that part of its success? It's so relatable to all of us.
Yeah, I would have to think so. And I think the fact that he put so much intention into how he was going to structure it and working off of what he had researched in other best-selling evergreen titles.
Yeah, that's amazing. Can you tell us about how he really invested a lot of his time into looking at the other books that were succeeding in the market?
Sure. One of the things that he spoke about, and actually, if any of your listeners, viewers, go and look for James Clear's interview with Tim Ferriss, toward the latter half of that, he talks about in depth writing Atomic Habits. And so one of the things he shared is how he researched, I don't know if it was hundreds, I don't want to say thousands, but I would not be surprised if it was thousands of titles of books that had been bestsellers. And so he noticed a lot of similarities. And so, like back then, there were a lot of the blank of blank. So one example is like The Subtle Art of Not Giving a You Know What.
Yeah.
And then you still see that title today, like The Psychology of Money was a recent bestseller. So it still comes up. And then I think for his ultimate title, he noticed that there were a lot of titles that were just 2 or 3 words where it was a strong adjective, a strong noun, but there was some kind of conflict or contrast between the two to make it appealing. So I think that's one reason why maybe Atomic Habits just works.
It sure does. Could you please treat us to an email that James Clear sent you?
Yeah. Let me pull it up. I'll read it verbatim. It's a little bit long, but it's really
I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, and this is where he talks more about kind of following some standards that he had discovered in researching all these books. And he talks about Mark Manson's book. So this is what he emailed me in, what was it, 2017. Just so people who don't know James's background, he was a blogger for like 10 years. So he absolutely put in the work before he wrote this book. But he starts this email. He says, my typical article length, meaning for his blog, is about 1,500 to 2,000 words. So I guess I lean toward the shorter end of things. However, a recent book, this is 2017, that I enjoyed from a reading flow standpoint was The Subtle Art of Not Giving a You Know What by Mark Manson. Mark is a friend and a strong writer, but I also think the length of his sections makes it an easy read. Each section feels substantial, but it never feels like too much work. The pages just flip by. I read the whole thing in a day or two. I'd love for my book to read as easily as his does. And then he actually broke it down because this is the way that James's brain works, and he's very methodical. He wrote, I think Mark told me his book is 54,000 words. It's 9 chapters, so that's about 6,000 words per chapter. He usually has 4 or 5 subsections per chapter, so that's about 1,200 to 1,500 words per subsection. I think these are reasonable targets, but I'm also open to shorter chapters too. So then he breaks down, I think my word count expectations would look something like this. Total word count, 70 to 80,000. Part count, 30,000 to 40,000. Chapter count, 6,000 to 7,000. Subsection, 1,200 to 1,500, which is kind of funny because his subsections go back to, he said, my typical article length is 1,500 to 2,000. So it's about the same. And then the last thing that he wrote, which I really like, and I recently just came across this again and have realized like how much this has affected how I work with clients still. He wrote that I should say that while I do want the book to be balanced, what I care about most is that it's an easy, quick, and engaging read. As a general rule, I think people are unlikely to recommend books they don't finish, and they don't finish books that are hard to read. I think that's
so
just
true.
Great advice.
When James Clear came to you, didn't he have a chapter that was 17,000 words long or something? Yeah. And I mention that because I think it gives all of us mere mortals hope.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I always advocate. So if a writer feels stuck, or if they don't know what to do, or they're worried about reception, or they just kind of get in their head too much, they kind of let their inner editor start speaking into their life before it should. Like, just get all your words out on the page. Like, just get it out. And then do your own self-editing pass if you can. And then bring on an experienced professional to help give you an outside perspective. Because, yeah, I think James is, he may even say this in his interview with Tim Ferriss, that his initial draft was 200,000 words. I don't know. It may have been much longer because I know he was working on it for a long time and he had tons of material. But when you have that amount of material, you can really mine for the gold in it. you find the diamonds that are going to shine, that's going to make a really convincing, compelling, full book that people will want to work all the way through, instead of like having to get through this stuff that just doesn't make sense or is boring or isn't as compelling.
Yeah, his research is really what separates him, I think, from so many others, is how far he's willing to go. When the book came out, I mean, I guess you could not have predicted it's one of the best-selling nonfiction books of all time. No one could predict that. Did you just start to see it more and more in the media and think, wow, this is really, really popular?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seemed like it took off immediately. I don't know if that's true. It felt that way. And then also it felt like that's when he kind of broke onto the scene, because I don't really know. He had a fairly substantial blog following, nothing in the order of magnitude of what his book allowed him to achieve. And then I always joke that I made the really smart financial decision when Atomic Habits came out, in 2019, I believe. Yeah. That's when I stopped freelancing. So just as soon as I could have maybe capitalized on how well it was doing, I was like, no, I'll do something different. But it was for a good reason. I actually took a full-time job, partly for benefits, partly for consistent work. It's just what my family needed at the time. And it was a great transition. But what's nice is that I was allowed to come back into freelancing because people were contacting me because I'd worked on Atomic Habits. And so I've really had the pleasure of, over the last year, just to work with some really good clients. And like Jefferson's is one of them.
And each new client shall lead to the next, if not multiples of that. And you've got all of that when Jefferson's book comes out.
I mean, yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah, that'll be terrific. Nothing is guaranteed, but it's pretty promising. I also wanted to ask you in terms of, because you're a book coach as well. I'm also a book coach. And when you work with people who are incredibly successful in their professional lives, someone like Jefferson Fisher, does even he kind of get the wobbles about, because a book is a completely different beast? And if so, how do you work with your clients on the confidence part of things?
It's a great question. One, I really like the word wobbles. I don't typically use that word, and I'm going to start using that with all of my clients.
Post-publication, the wobbles.
Oh, man, absolutely. I would say, I would doubt that you're a human if you don't get the wobbles. We all do, regardless of the success that we've had, especially when an author is working on their first book and they really don't know how it's going to be received. I think for James, he had a good built-in audience. I don't think anyone expected his book to do what it did. So I can't really speak to James's wobbliness before the book came out. I'm sure he felt some trepidation about it. But for Jefferson, because we met in person and that was a lot more recent, I think there's a different kind of pressure because he already has such a substantial following and this is his first book. Sure. And so I would say, yes, there are wobbles, but there's still confidence. Because he really believes in his book and he really believes in helping people. That's honestly, when I look back for the reason that I got into freelancing is that I want to help people who are helping people. I don't mind being the guy in the background because I really think these authors are doing really good work that are really affecting people where they live and the quality of their life.
Yeah. No, I think that's terrific. I like to say that if your book helps one person, that should be fantastic to know that you've improved someone's life, and then anything beyond that. But of course, you've invested time and finances and stuff into it. So it's about expectations. So I wanted to know whether, you said that you prefer being in the background, but whether you have any plans to write a book, could be the craft of nonfiction, because you have a lot to share.
Yeah. So there's a funny thing. I do actually have a book on Amazon about editing, but I released it 10 years ago. It's essentially kind of a business card as a book. And I don't really promote it anymore because I wrote it 10 years ago. And honestly, it's mostly kind of advice from other people that I compiled together. And so I thought it was helpful. But more recently, I wrote a short ebook that's on my website. This is the self-promo pitch. Yep. And it's the lead generation for my email newsletter list that I send out twice a month. And the ebook is called The 4I Method, DIY Developmental Editing for Nonfiction Authors. And it's really short. It's the 4 questions that tend to run through my mind every time I'm developmentally editing something. So I think it could be helpful for nonfiction authors as they're reviewing their own material hopefully before they send it to another professional editor. But I just think they're really simple questions, but they can be really helpful.
Can you give us an example of one of those questions?
Yeah, of course, I'm probably going to forget the 4 I's as I talk about them. At least the first I, so we'll tease it so people will go and download the book.
Yes.
The first I is it imperative?
Yes.
And you can almost see where I'm going with it, but
Yes.
go download the book.
I was picking up my kids from school yesterday, and your words popped into my head, which was the comment that you left in an author's manuscript was interesting but superfluous.
Yeah, I like that one.
It's great. It's great. You've got to kill the darlings along the way. If it doesn't relate back to the overarching theme of the book, it's going to slow down the pace.
Yeah. And one of the things I wrote this the other day, and I don't know if I'm the first one to write it, but I like how it sounded, which may sound morbid, but it is October, where it was like, kill your darlings, but save the bodies. Meaning that for nonfiction authors, I say, there are things that we're going to have to trim from this, but you should save it in a different file because you can either use it as a blog post, social media, ebook. Like there are other places that you could possibly use that material, unless it really is total garbage. Then it goes to the trash. But there are still ways. I always encourage authors to, keep their darlings just in a different file.
In a basement down below.
Yeah.
All the bodies. That's because I'm always saying this content could be repurposed. It could be
Absolutely.
a speech. It could be, a blog post. It's just not for this specific book. But that can be a real heart-wrenching idea for the author to let go of that. Would you agree that it's as important what you leave out as what you put in?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. It sounds like you love collaboration with authors, writers, other editors. Do you find that really rewarding work?
Yes, I do, especially the one-to-one stuff where you really get to know an author over a period of time and you kind of have this ongoing relationship. And honestly, I hope that most of my clients want to write multiple books. I know that Jefferson is not keen on that at the moment. I don't blame him because he's a very busy guy. But I do. I mean, I read his first book and I'm like, you need to write another one. We need to do this again. It's so good.
Yeah, I can imagine if he speaks well, he would write well.
Yeah.
He thinks well. I think that's what makes him different. He's really unique, and he says hard things in an easy way. I feel like
that's so well put. Exactly.
Yeah, he's amazing. So if any person in Australia wanted to work with one of the world's best editors and ghostwriters, where could they find you to approach you?
Well, they should go to Hembury Books. They should, because you're local and then you offer the same stuff. Now, my website is my name, blakeatwood.com. And then I have a contact form on there where anybody can contact me. And even if it's just a question that they have or a follow-up to this podcast, regardless of if it's about working together or not, I appreciate the messages. And I try to respond in a couple of business days, try to respond quickly. And then if anybody wants to connect on LinkedIn, that's typically where I'm hanging out on social media. Let me put that a different way. That's typically where I'm procrastinating from the work I should be doing. I'm just scrolling and posting and seeing all the success of everybody else.
It's a water cooler.
It is.
On to go and get back to work and have some output that we can post about. Blake, thank you so much for coming on the Hembury Books podcast. It's been amazing.
Well, thank you. This was fun.